everybody. This is Diane Dobry for Discovery Days. And today we're going to be speaking to Gourmet coffee enthusiast and home roaster of coffee. He roasts his own coffee beans, Pete Hornbuckle. Welcome, Pete. Thanks for coming and talking to us about your process for this National Gourmet Coffee Day.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
I know we've been talking about doing this for a long time, and actually it was going to be a written article, but this may be even better doing it verbally and showing the process online. So why don't you start telling us about your pre-roasting days as a coffee drinker, and what was it that you think made you change your coffee buying and coffee drinking habits?
Well, being my sister, we were raised in a coffee drinking house. I mean, mom drank coffee, dad didn't. There was an early exposure to coffee as a kid. But, early adulthood, I didn't drink coffee. And to be honest with you, I can't remember when I really started drinking coffee. I did not start out as an enthusiast. Drank coffee here and there. I guess then when I got married, my wife was a pretty serious coffee drinker. Every day her girls drank coffee. It might have had something to do with at a certain job that I worked in downtown Houston. I worked near a place named Specs Liquor Warehouse, which sells liquor and wine, but they also have gourmet foods. And I started to see coffees, so I think I started to experiment there a little bit. Back then, of course, I made good money, so I bought the most expensive coffee at the time was Kona from Kona, Hawaii, which is an excellent coffee and has actually just priced itself way out of my range now. And at some point, we started shopping at a new local grocery store who actually carried a local supplier named Lola Savannah. And I tried a few. A lot of these coffees will have just a basic description of what flavors to expect. And one of them that popped out at me was Guatemalan, which talked about being like chocolatey flavors. And another was a Peruvian, which had a buttery flavor. So I tried both of those, and some of the Guatemalan just seemed too strong, too chocolatey. And the Peruvian was too light and too buttery. So I guess one day I just decided, hey, let's combine these and see what we get. Never afraid to experiment. And the result was just amazing to me. I might have tweaked the combination, but I think I ended up at a 50-50 blend. And I drank that for so long that I ended up naming it. I just took the two names, put them together, and it was Guaruvian. And then when they stopped carrying one or the other occasionally, I actually made connection directly with the local roaster in downtown Houston. And I used to make an order and drive down there.
So you started blending them. So what were the priorities you had in drinking the coffee? What were you looking for? And that made you interested in mixing them?
Flavors, right? I just wanted a pleasurable coffee experience. Who doesn't, right? In fact, now when I tell people about my roasting, you get reactions from people. But of course now, and I imagine somewhat back then, but now, my goodness, Starbucks is like everybody's go-to, which is kind of depressing because now as you call gourmet enthusiast, Starbucks is nothing but burnt coffee. Really, to me, they burn their coffee so that you pay extra for all those flavors that they add in and all these processes that they do.
So you had said the Guatemalan was too chocolatey, and what was the Peruvian was a little too something else, and it was buttery. What was the balance you were looking for? Because I know, like when I was doing wine import, I really liked a certain smoothness to it. Some people like the tannin, some people like sweet or the level of sugar. What was it in the coffee that you were looking for?
I don't know that I had a goal in mind, except as, to just explore. And then when I found something that worked, I stuck with it.
Mm-hmm.
I did remember something as I was telling you about Guatemalan, the Kona my understanding with the Kona coffee that grown in the volcanic region, I mean, because really the Hawaiian Islands, it's all volcanic. The fact that Guatemalan is also grown in volcanic regions and volcanic soil, there was a direct comparison. Mostly chocolate notes, but a little bit of nuttiness, maybe. Always, you want a good, full bodied coffee, that creamy mouth feel kind of thing. When I was drinking Kona at the time, mom and dad would travel quite a bit, and I know they went on, I guess it was a Latin America cruise, and they must have stopped somewhere outside Guatemala, and mom picked up some Guatemalan coffee for me. But this was literally unlabeled coffee in a cellophane bag that was in a burlap bag. And she brought this pound of coffee back, and here, I bought you coffee in Guatemala. Okay, thanks. To be honest with you, when I smelled the bag, it smelled like cat urine. I mean, it just had this funky smell to it.
Mm.
And I was, oh God, I really don't want to drink this. But one day I thought, hey, it's from mom. Let me give it a try. And the weirdest thing, it did not taste anything like it smelled. That's when I really realized that, hey, Guatemalan has some similarities to Kona. Let me explore this. So I think that's what kind of put me in line with the whole Guatemalan theme.
Uh-huh.
The Peruvian was just, hey, let me try something else, and then the blend happened there just to cut. Really, it was the Guatemalan was the base. The Peruvian was just cutting it back a little bit because it was too strong, too chocolatey. Um, Really, the flavor I was picking up from the Peruvian was like kind of a roasted pine nut. So there was a familiar taste there that kind of added to the body, the creamy mouthfeel that maybe wasn't present in the variety of Guatemalan that I was getting. And understand that just because you get Guatemalan coffee, my goodness, there's hundreds of regions in just Guatemala alone that have different soils, and there's even different types of coffee trees varieties that I couldn't even sit here and speak about. I know of their existence, but I couldn't tell you the difference between them.
Well, let me go back
Um,
to when you went to that store. You found that store that roasted their own coffee. Did you buy ground, or did you buy the beans that they had made and then you ground them yourself?
well,
And
I'm sure I bought ground coffee first, and then as I got more and more into it, I found out, well, if you get whole bean, it's fresher. So then I had to go find. I was probably quote unquote grinding like a lot of people think they grind their coffee, and they have these little $20 spice
grinders.
choppers, and it's just a spinning blade, which I mean to a real coffee enthusiast is like a joke, right? Because you don't get a uniform grind. It spins so fast it actually heats the grounds as it's grinding it or chopping it, which is just not desired. The idea is to get a burr grinder, which really has either cones or flat discs that have these burrs that stick out, and the coffee bean gets like caught in between and it rolls over it and grinds it. And you're supposed to get a more uniform grind, but even when you get into grinders, like I had to settle for $100 grinder, and that was like painful to pay $100 for a coffee grinder. I mean, Mary looked at me like I was insane, and that's a low level grinder.
Mm.
I don't even get uniform grinds out of it, but it's way more uniform than a chopper. I mean, you got to get into $400, and gosh, that was 20 years ago. It might even be more than that.
What made you decide to go from, okay, so now you're like enjoying the flavor and you got the grinder that makes it a little bit better of a grind. What made you decide to say, well, I'm going to start roasting my own coffee?
I didn't seek that out. It actually fell in my lap. I had I have a son-in-law that was going on a mission trip to Guatemala, and remembering the story about mom getting me that coffee, I thought, hey, maybe another, diamond in the rough. Maybe he can get me some street side coffee or something. So I said, hey, Sean, bring me home some coffee from Guatemala. Sure thing, man, no problem. So he returns, and we actually met at a restaurant, and he walks in with this giant bag of these green coffee beans. They look like split peas, right? That you'd make split pea soup or something.
Mm.
And he plops this bag down on the table. I'm like, what is this? Like, what? What'd you get me? He's like, oh, you said bring coffee. There's coffee. I'm like, wow, okay. So you brought me green unroasted beans. What am I supposed to do with this?
Mm.
Well, ironically, at the time, I met someone who was doing their own coffee roasting, and even through meeting them and discussing it, it was not like, wow, this is something I got to try. Just like, oh, that's interesting, right? But when he handed me this bag of coffee beans, I went home and called that friend and I said, hey, I just got handed a couple of pounds of green beans. Can you roast it for me? And she says, well, my roaster only does about a half a pound at a time. I mean, you're going to be over here every other day. So through discussion, she asked me if I had an air popper that pops popcorn. I said, yeah, we do actually. Why do you ask? She said, that's actually one of the best methods, especially to get started in coffee roasting. You
Yeah.
just roast the beans like you would popcorn, but they're not going to pop like popcorn and they're going to take a little bit longer than popcorn, but make sure you don't put too much in there and just start with a little bit and experiment and see where it takes you. So I took her advice and started roasting some coffee in the popcorn popper. And sure enough, it was turning out some amazing coffee from these green coffee beans. I got so enthusiastic with it, as a matter of fact, I started roasting one batch after another after another. I melted the top of
Oh my
this
gosh.
air popper and ended up having to like fashion some heavy duty foil as a shield to keep the top from melting, or
Mm.
just take long periods of time between the rows. That really turned out some good coffee, but it just wasn't making enough.
So then how did you develop what you're doing now?
Now we're in an age with online shopping and Amazon and whatnot. Yeah, the world's at your fingertips if you have a computer. So I just started to do a little online research, and I found that they have these baskets that you can put if you have a rotisserie grill. Well, I mean, one of my other passions is grilling food. We always have a rotisserie grill. So I found a small basket that was available on Amazon, ordered it up, and started experimenting with that. And then, of course, once I got proficient with that, I noticed they had a larger basket to where I
Mm.
could do about a pound and a quarter at a time. And really, that's where I'm at now. Now, the rotisserie motor that comes with the grill, for rotisserie chicken is very slow, right? You want to spin that chicken very slowly. I quickly discovered that it's not quick enough for the beans. So that's where I researched and found a higher end rotisserie motor, and that was certainly worth the expense. I think it was about $75 or so at the time. But it's a variable speed. I can turn the speed up and down. I can reverse the direction, so I have a lot more control over the spinning. But the basket just sits over my grill, and it's really up to me to regulate the temperature and whatnot on the grill. But it got me into roasting for not a whole lot, not as much as a lot of other people spend on professional home roasting equipment.
So did you watch like YouTube videos, or was there like a place where you found like here's the way you would do it on a grill?
There really is not a lot of content. I mean, I might have looked. I really don't remember. I might have looked, and there really wasn't much out there on doing what I'm doing. But probably a handful of videos. I found more reading articles on the stages of the roasting, and I learned about things like charge temperature. And I learned the hard way. I mean, I went through many, many pounds of coffee that, maybe like didn't turn out as well as it could, and found out about charge temperature, which is your pre-roasting temperature. So now when I get started, I will put the basket on the rotisserie spit, put it on the motor, light the grill, and walk away for 10 or 15 minutes on high and get that temperature up 700 degrees, which might be more than some of the experts recommend. But, I mean, I had to go by what people were saying and then go try it and then try something else. I tend to get into hobbies where I can apply a scientific method and then kind of run with it from there. I mean, if it was costing me hundreds of dollars per time, I probably wouldn't do it. But you know, um, I'm buying green coffee at about roughly $6 a pound, and after several experiments, I feel fairly proficient that I'm turning out a pretty decent product. In fact, I belong to a Facebook group. It's just like home coffee roasters. There's dozens of them out there. I think this is the largest one though,
Mhm.
where people share information, and they'll talk about different facets of roasting or what equipment they might use.
I'll try to add
Okay.
that at the end. I'll try to.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you also, how much did it cost you to get all these components that you needed? You were kind of doing a trial and error along the way, and you got the, what was it,
Well, the rotisserie basket, I think the small one might have been in the $20 range. The larger one might have been 25, 30, $35 for that. I already had the rotisserie spit. As I said, the motor, the new rotisserie motor, was about $75. So maybe a little over $100 right there.
Mhm.
Um, and really that's about it. It's just buying the coffee at that point.
Where do you get your coffee?
So getting the coffee, there's many suppliers. The probably most notable and where I started was with Sweet Maria's.
Mhm. Yeah.
They're an interesting supplier. If you watch Seinfeld, they are like the Jay Peterman of coffee. They get very romantic about the farmers and the farms, and they write up these stories, and you'll see it on the bottom of my spec sheets. I actually, if I have room, I'll put the information about the farm. So while I'm roasting, I'm rereading, because I have 5, 10 varieties of coffee on hand or more at any one time, and I'll rotate. I like variety. So some people will buy one type and they'll roast that for a half a year, and then they'll move on. With Sweet Maria's, the problem is you find a coffee you like, and by the time you buy it, and hey, I like this, and you go back and buy it, it's gone. Right? They buy so much coffee from a farmer. And understand, when I'm buying this green coffee, I tend to buy what they call single source, single origin. I'm buying coffee from one farmer in Guatemala. And when you get that, it's a limited quantity. When he sells out, that's it until next year. And then you're getting the next year crop, which is actually different than last year's crop, because it's
Mm.
it's an organic thing. I mean, the average consumer coffee, you're getting blends that could be dozens, if not maybe even hundreds of varieties of coffee, that some super taster sits there, takes all these coffees, and carefully blends this so that when Folgers puts out their coffee, or Dunkin' Donuts coffee, when they put out their coffee, they're putting out a uniform product that has a similar taste, that they want people to come back and return to that coffee. That's a great thing, right? I mean, but there's also, to the coffee enthusiast, there's an appeal
Right.
to trying these single source varieties where you're getting all these little specific flavors that can be, fruity and citrusy and nutty and chocolatey and buttery, honey, caramel, all these flavors. And they will describe it. The Sweet Maria's tasters will go over and sample this and roast it and cup it and taste it, and then they write up these romantic stories about the farmer and the taste of their coffee, and then they present it online, and I'll get a tickler email that says, hey, we got this new Guatemalan coffee. Oh, great. And I'll run out there and quick buy 5, 10, maybe even 20 pounds at a time, if it sounds good and it's reasonably priced. But by the time that gets shipped to me, if I do a roast and I like it, go back, it's sold out. Right?
Can you?
Another place is Coffee Bean Corral. I think they tend to get more blends, but they will be from a certain region. So they'll have a type of coffee that goes by a certain name and region, but they seem to have lots of it. Like, it's like they never run out. And
Mm.
I don't know how they do that, other than they must be getting blends from the region and just amassing these larger quantities, so that when people return, they're getting that variety, but it's still from a country and a region, under a certain name.
So, like Sweet Maria's, you can't get the same one every time you order, but from Coffee Bean Corral, you can get the same blend multiple times.
They seem to, and I can't even, like I said, I don't know if I can call it a blend because they don't advertise that.
Hmm.
but they don't have the romantic stories, about the farmer and this and that. They just have the name of the coffee. They have a little blurb right up about it, and then typically what you're reading there is comments and feedback. They actually have a little mini forum under each one, where Sweet Maria's does not do that,
I see.
because once it's a one and done, right? So
Right.
there's literally no discussion on Sweet Maria's, whereas Coffee Bean Corral, you can look back years on comments if people have
Mhm.
commented, and ratings, how they like their coffee and maybe how they roasted it to what level, and then they'll share their experience, and you can go by that. Another thing I like about Coffee Bean Corral is their online search function. Being an ex computer programmer, I love their filtering. I mean, you can filter by flavor and rating, location, what country of origin. There's tons of search criteria that you can put into their search filter, and it pops up several different, or you can whittle it down to just a small few selections. But they do seem to carry the same type year round for years. And I never
Hmm.
really explored how to do that. I don't buy from them a lot because their shipping is more expensive. And again, I'm cheap, and I really like a lot of stuff with Sweet Maria's. So I do tend to buy from them.
Is there like a limit to how long you would store it with that, before you can roast it? And
Right.
so,
So one of the appeals of buying green coffee beans, if you store it properly, it can last on your shelf in your pantry for up to 2 years or more, because it's a dehydrated, dried, like, I mean, think of nuts and beans, like beans, bagged, stored, dried beans can last on the shelf for years.
mhm.
The idea is to keep it away from heat and humidity, is really the thing. Now, the storage method, when I got into it, there was a whole thing about storing them in muslin or cotton bags that breathe. Suddenly, there's been a shift in the industry in the past year. Like, oh no, no, you don't want to do that because they're dried to a certain humidity, and if you don't store it in that exact humidity, then they can get moisture, which is going to break down the bean. No, 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 you want to do it in vacuum sealing, or Sweet Maria sells these. I think they're called Eco Tact. These triple lined Ziploc bags, heavy duty Ziploc bags, and you squeeze the air out, and you can store your coffee in there. I was, I mean, I threw my hands up in the air like, you're kidding me, right? Because my wife and I've been vacuum sealing frozen foods and storing, buying large quantities of food, maybe storing it for decades. I have all the equipment to do that. In fact, one of my favorite methods is to store stuff in mason jars with the vacuum seal has an attachment where you can put it over the top of the mason jar. In fact, the largest bottles we had on hand were quart jars. I went online and I found half-gallon mason jars that I now use, which fit about 3.3 pounds of green coffee beans. So if I buy 10 pounds, three of these jars, I can store, 10 pounds of green coffee
And then
in
you
these
vacuum
large.
seal the jar
And, I,
with.
and I vacuum seal the jar,
Hmm,
and then put them up on the shelf in the pantry, and then I cover them because light, apparently light
right.
is bad. So I cover them with the burlap sacks that I was using before that I no longer use. Just kind of throw them over there.
So how do you manage your schedule for roasting? You seem to have a plan on how often you roast, and because and
Yeah,
does
it's
it can
as
you
needed.
start using can you start using the roasted coffee beans right away, or do you have to let them sit after you've roasted them?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a multi-phase question there. So I'd like to think that there's a schedule, but really it's like, while I'm making coffee in the morning, I look in and go, uh-oh, I'm about out of coffee. I need to roast soon.
How
I
many, how
usually,
often is that about?
well, roughly every 2 weeks, but then again, it depends on how much I roast at a time.
Mhm.
Sometimes I'll do two 1.25 pound batches, and understand that's what I call a green weight. When you roast coffee, you lose weight. right? Because you're dispelling even more moisture, and
Mm.
the cooking process burns off some weight. So it probably ends up with just a hair over a pound if I roast a pound and a quarter. But if I have a pound and a half left, I'm not gonna split. I'm not gonna do a whole half a pound, or a pound and a half, or really, if it's like a pound and three quarters, that's too much to do at once. It just doesn't. There's not enough heat capacity in my grill to do that, so I'll split that. So a lot of times I'm looking at my remaining. If I'm down to the last bit, like, do I have enough for one, or do I have too much and I got to split it into two? So that's going to dictate, right? But one or two, I'm sorry, two or three batches will typically last me about 2 weeks. But that's kind of a rough, certainly longer than a week. Maybe 2 to 3 weeks is going to be average. And then to answer your question on how quickly, well, different varieties have different properties. With the Guatemalans, I find I can't really touch those for about 3 days. Sometimes I can't wait. I'm out of coffee and I'll drink one, maybe after 24, 48 hours. But it's usually never optimum till about 3 days out and
Okay.
longer.
So then you put
And
in this, I put these up. This is what you stored in after you roast it, because you have the sealed, the vacuum sealed mason jars for the green beans, but then you put it in here. And now you said you just said you store it for 3 days before you use it in this kind of a
well,
container.
I do, because what happens with coffee beans, and this is a common term in the industry, is degassing. When you roast probably anything, especially dried uh, nuts or beans or things like that, carbon dioxide is emitted very heavily at first, and then I'm sure there's a Boolean curve, not Boolean. Oh, what's the? I can't think of the term. But there's
A bell curve.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. A bell curve where at the very beginning you're off gassing a lot, and that's why it's really, your coffee typically doesn't taste real good until a lot of that off gassing occurs. And if you see in the picture you're displaying, that little valve at the bottom, that is similar to the valve. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed on a bag of coffee that you buy commercially. There's a valve on the front. It looks like they poked a hole in the bag. That's a one-way valve that lets the carbon dioxide gas out, but keeps oxygen from getting in, because oxygen, never a good thing with fresh food. It makes
Mhm.
it spoil quicker.
Same with
So a valve like that is going to let that degassing occur
Mhm.
without letting oxygen get in. And the off gassing happens, I'm sure, for several days, if not maybe a week or two. But it's very heavy at the beginning. So actually, I also use mason jars to store my freshly roasted beans. I
Oh.
try to keep one or two empty jars on hand. And a technique that I've learned is that, if you're familiar with a mason jar, the lid is actually the flat part that sits on the rim, and then you have that outer ring that basically holds the lid on. And traditional canning, you boil whatever's in your jar, and it burps out the gas, and then eventually, as it cools, it creates a vacuum which sucks that lid onto the jar. Well, with coffee degassing, freshly roasted coffee, if you just sit that lid on there and then put the ring on real loose, the carbon dioxide gas will burp out the lid, and then gravity will pull that lid back onto the rim. So
Oh.
you in effect have a one-way valve, but it's a
Mhm.
very large valve, right? So I will typically put my stuff just into those, you know, at first, and then as it is done degassing, I will uh, move it into the cans, or I've bought generic coffee bags that have valves in them as
Mhm.
well,
Uh-huh.
and put them in there just so it's stored more traditionally. I've found these cans more recently and tend to use those because they're easier to reuse. You wipe them out. You don't want to wash them with water because that one-way valve is made
Uh-huh.
of paper. It will
Oh,
destroy the valve. But
so
wipe them out and air them out and reuse them.
why don't we get to the talking about the process? So you were talking about is this from Sweet Maria's here? These are the,
That is a Sweet Maria type of coffee. Basically, I steal off of their website these graphs on the left under my hand.
they have this
Took a
one.
picture. Yeah, that's a different variety of coffee, but similar. They score the coffee, so that's a score graph, and
Mhm.
around that ring, there's different types of characteristics. Your body, uniformity, sweetness, different things like that. They grade each thing, and then they come up with an overall score. And then
Mhm.
on the right is going to be your flavor profile, where you got your cocoa and nuttiness and honey and caramel and sweetness, citrus and berry. These are all the different flavors. And so based on the cone uh, that's sticking out, it's going to be the greater amount of that. So you can see on this one here, it's
Cocoa.
got a very good amount of body and cocoa. I think over here is
That was
sweetness,
oh,
right?
okay.
Sweetness and honey.
Mhm.
So I like to have that just so at a quick glance I can kind of see if I'm roasting a few kinds of coffee. I don't want to roast coffee that all have the same or similar profile. I'll grab these sheets and kind of say, all right, well, here's one that's got more caramel. Maybe this one has more honey and nut flavor. So I'll have a couple of different ones that are variety. And then below that, I take their notes where they kind of describe the flavors to expect and
Mhm.
then the typical roast range, because some coffees roast are better lighter, where they're what they call their top notes come out. Maybe it's more berry or more nutty or more caramely. You'll get those top notes at the lighter roasts, and then typically, and with the variety I like, the Guatemalans, as you roast further into the darker roast, the chocolate really moves to the forefront.
Mhm.
So I keep these notes on hand just so that when I'm trying to select a coffee to roast, and then during the roasting process, as I'm roasting, I'm rereading because again, I'm got maybe a dozen different coffees on hand at any given time. I can't memorize all these different types. So I've got my little cheat sheet there that reminds me of like, okay, this is one that I want to roast to about this level. Maybe I'll experiment based on what I'm reading in the notes.
So do you want to just tell
So
briefly what it says? City, city plus, full city plus. Do you want to just quickly explain what those are?
Sure, yeah, and it's going to have to be brief because I don't know where anyone came up with this,
Mhm.
but there's this method of describing roasts, and generally the acceptable drinkable roast levels are going to be city plus, which is definitely in the lighter range. You then move to full city, which is going to be anywhere between city plus and full city is going to be your medium roast range, and then beyond that you get into full city plus to your Vienna or French roast, which is definitely into your darker roast where you're going to do your espressos.
Mhm.
Beyond that, oh gosh, I don't know if there's anything really beyond
And
that other than just burnt.
the thing
You know,
that surprised me is when you told me that it's a lighter roasts, not the espresso roasts that have more caffeine in it.
yeah, it's a common misconception. People think, oh, I like a nice, you know, morning breakfast blend of dark roast. I like that kick in the morning. But caffeine is, I mean, really, I can't speak to the food chemistry of it. But as you cook foods, you destroy a lot of chemical compounds. And caffeine is certainly a chemical compound that my understanding is as you roast further into the roast range, you're destroying that coffee. And I mean, some may be familiar with, in some health food and energy drinks, they have green coffee extract.
Mhm.
because of the high caffeine rate. Now, you'd never want to brew straight green coffee by itself. I mean, you'd probably get sick from it, and it really
Yeah.
wouldn't taste good. But
Mhm.
if you wanted a real caffeine kick, boy, I mean, eat a couple of green coffee beans. Like I said, if you can stomach it.
Mhm.
My understanding is that yes, the caffeine is at its highest level green, and as you roast, that caffeine level actually goes down. Now, I don't know if some coffee expert could come in and
Yeah.
explain the minute details of that, but that is my understanding. But it is a common misconception.
Okay, so
Darker coffees are stronger.
let's show what you actually go through here. You've got this set up.
Right. So I've gone into my pantry. It's time to roast. I preheated the grill. I put the rotisserie with the basket on there, get it preheated. Pick out my coffees, kind of get all my tools and accoutrements set up for the roast process. And then I'm ready. I weigh out a pound and a quarter of coffee. And, I put it in that vessel, that bowl there. And then when it's time to go, I've got my timer ready. I stop the rotisserie so the basket flips open. I dump my coffee, the green beans into the roasting cage, close the lid, and I start the rotisserie and I start the timer. As you see it under there, I've got actually two different um,
Temperature.
thermometers. This is one of the disadvantages of using a home grill. Um, and we'll get into it here in a minute. It's uneven, right? The burners in my grill don't heat exactly evenly for a precise process of roasting coffee. It's great for throwing a steak or a hamburger on there, but for doing coffee, it's not. So I think I had some really bad burners at that time, and I was literally trying to measure the temperature on both sides of the basket
Uh-huh.
at that time.
So let's see. So the next thing is, so you have a timer, right? You at a
I
certain.
do. I kind of picked an arbitrary number of every 3 minutes. I actually tilt the basket side to side. There's a fin in the basket, and we don't have a picture or close up of that. That helps while it's turning. It helps toss the beans, but it
Mhm.
tosses them in a, I mean, just it doesn't flip them side to side. It just rolls with the rotation of the basket. So if I have a hot spot on one side of the grill and it's cooler on the other, I started to notice that when I got done with a roast, the beans on one side of the basket were darker than on the other side. So
Mm.
I just kind of arbitrarily picked a time about every 3 minutes. I have a timer that goes off. I stop it. I quickly just kind of shake it side to side to get a more uniform roast. I'll pop it back on there as quickly as possible because really, and I've read this on my Facebook group. Um, you really don't want to stop a roast, and if you interrupt that cooking process for too long, you could end up ruining your roast. Now, I don't think I'm doing that. I'm turning out some pretty good coffee, but I don't know if I would go into a coffee roasting competition, and yes, they have those.
Oh, I'm sure.
I probably would not fare well with this process, but as a hobbyist, it's great. I despise really all other coffee. If I had to drink any coffee that I didn't roast myself, Dunkin' Donuts coffee actually is pretty good. It's a good fallback when I run out of coffee, but that doesn't happen often.
Let me ask you. So when you take it out and you shake it about, you don't want these beans to get too cool. So how long do you
Right.
do that for? About like 30 seconds?
Uh, oh, not even, 15, 20 seconds tops. I'm trying to, just quickly just do a distribution and pop it back on there and close that lid as quickly as possible.
And then again, then how long is your timer going? And the second time do you take it out?
Well, as I said, about every 3 minutes I do the stir, right? But then as far as timing for the roast, you can't necessarily go by a timer. If we're going to discuss the actual roasting process, um, there's physical changes that happen to the bean as you're roasting them, and during that process, right? So when you first put cold green beans on in the basket on the grill, they are absorbing heat. They are endothermic. So
Mhm.
you're applying as much heat as you can to get those beans heated up. You're trying to do it evenly, so it's spinning. It's letting that hot air flow around the beans as it's tossing them. And as the beans start to come up to temperature, right, chemistry starts to kick in, and the bean will actually go from endothermic to exothermic, where they actually are starting to, I mean, in a very deep chemistry sense, they're actually starting to burn or cook. They're actually becoming exothermic, where they're actually giving off their own heat. And at that turn, a process happens in the coffee roasting industry called first crack. The
Mhm.
beans will actually start to pop like popcorn, and it's the first. And there's two separate cracks. The first one, very volatile, right? I mean, it's popping like popcorn. This is what's happening. The moisture in there, the bean can't contain the moisture anymore, so it starts to split and open up, and it's very audible, or usually very audible. I guess there are some instances where if you're not roasting at the right temperatures, or if you have some set of bad beans, or I mean, there's even weather. Like if I'm roasting in cold weather, it throws off the whole thing because I'm just doing it on a grill.
Right.
That can kind of affect it. But typically, you're listening for that first crack, and that will tip if you're very consistent with your roast approach. Mine is happening at about 10 to 12 minutes, which is really the maximum. I guess I'm roasting too much coffee, or I'm just not throwing out enough heat. The aficionados all say, "Oh, you should be hitting first crack at 7 or 8 minutes." And when I did it on the popper, I was probably hitting that at those time intervals too. But you're doing about a quarter of a pound of coffee at a time. I mean, that's what enough for about 2 cups for me.
Yeah.
That's why I got into this basket thing. I was just getting tired of having to roast coffee. I don't enjoy roasting it as much as I enjoy drinking it. It
Right.
becomes a little bit of a labor of love.
Well, you said now this is after first crack, right? This picture.
Well, so first crack has just occurred. And what happens, like I said, you go from endothermic to exothermic. So now you're applying all this external heat. Well, then the beans are generating their own heat. If you don't start to reverse that process, that heating process a little bit, you're going to burn your beans real quick. Before I learned this, my beans were going from first crack to second crack in about 30 seconds. In fact, I almost didn't know that second crack was occurring. And I started to notice I was getting very dark roasts very quickly. And if I didn't stop it soon after, I was burning a lot of coffee. So, in reading lots of feedback from people talking about, that these people have these professional roasters that have automatic cooling fans that kick in at this stage. But well, if I'm doing all this manually, I've got to kind of mimic what these machines are doing. So I keep a stand fan on hand for a couple of reasons. And what's happening now, I'm just lifting the lid and I'm introducing a little bit of cooler air from the outside. I've turned down the burners and letting that exothermic process start to kick in while bringing down the temperature and just kind of controlling it as much as possible while first crack is occurring. So yes, this is towards the middle to late. I don't do it instantaneously. When I hear first crack happen, I kind of wait and hear it cracking and how aggressively it's going to crack, and then maybe as it's starting to wane a little bit, I'll start to turn down that temperature, introduce some cool air, let first crack finish, and then adjust the temperature back on. And I'm also looking at those thermometers, to see what temperature, right? I mean, typically I'm at 550 to 600 degrees or more in the grill. Now I'm trying to back it down to about 500, no less than 450. I mean, at that point, you're just baking the beans. You're not roasting
Uh-huh.
at anything less than 450. So a lot happening there, but yes, essentially that's what I'm doing there. I'm trying to lower the temperature quickly to take
Uh-huh.
control of the next. And actually, this is the part that they call the development stage. This is where those flavors are developing, right? Sugars are caramelizing inside the bean. Other flavors are starting to blossom at this stage, and this is where the real art is, right at this point, where you're using the heat and the roasting process to kind of get those flavors to come out to the forefront, and then stopping the roast in time that you're letting those flavors kind of remain, or you're trying to move it to a darker roast where you're holding on to some of those top notes and you know
And that's when you decide about second crack. Do you always do a second crack, or I know you said sometimes you have to
it
try.
yeah, again, it depends, and I like to have a variety of coffee on hand, so there's sometimes that I like a lighter roast. Typically my first cup in the morning is going to be a lighter roast, so I like to have some of that on hand. Then my second cup, I like a darker roast. And I guess I decided that based on the whole caffeine content thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the general public thinks if it tastes strong, it is strong, where it's actually opposite. I like that caffeine kick in the morning, so yeah, I'll have a brighter cup of coffee with some top note flavors, and then I'm moving into more of a darker roast that has chocolate and caramely flavors, and I'll possibly even dress that with a little bit of more creamer or something like that for a second cup of coffee.
So
But
now,
yeah, it just depends on what I'm looking for in any type, and then that's when I decide how far I'm going to take a roast.
this picture is that once you're done and you're like, okay, it's at the point where I want it, right?
Right. So now I want to stop the heating process as quickly as possible. But another thing that is inherent in home roasting is, you know, coffee is an organic process, right? And the bean is actually a seed that's inside of a cherry, as they call it. Real coffee beans, if you see coffee growing on a tree, it looks like a cherry tree. They're discarding that cherry fruit and they're taking the seed out, which is what they're calling the coffee bean. It's actually the seed. And in that process, there's several layers to the coffee bean that, when roasted, becomes a substance called chaff. Right? It's just a papery lining that is undesirable. You really don't want it. And then, so what happens is, as you're roasting, that paper starts to fall off and gets kind of stuck. So here, what I'm doing is I'm cooling, but I'm also de-chaffing the beans.
Yeah, and I'm
I'm
gonna
actually,
show
if
a
you,
video that I took of that. I'm gonna stick that in
oh
here.
right, yeah, you did, and you can see the chaff flying out of the basket. All of it makes it out of the basket. So I actually will go from this point. This is immediately. I just took it off. I'm getting it in front of the fan, because as soon as you can get that temperature to drop quickly, supposedly you're stopping the cooking process. But I further take this, and I think you have a slide of me dumping the beans into a bowl.
Yeah. Well, first I have this. This is what they look like.
Well,
And
yes. So when you were taking these pictures, I opened it to show you, and sometimes I will pop it open just to kind of see. This is a little bit, looks like I roasted this a little bit darker from the picture. A little bit,
yeah.
was going
And
for a
then
little
you
bit of
have
a
this
darker roast there.
kind of where you
Well,
can.
right. So Sweet Maria's loves to put things in your package of coffee, and they put these little index cards together with different things. This was one that they included. Um, uh, it's almost like a roasting guide. It shows you the green coffee, uh, and then the yellowing, and then the different roast stages, all the way to the where they say call the fire department for the burnt
That's
coffee bean at the end. Yeah, and I think on the flip side, I don't know if we got a picture of that. There's actually a graphic scale that shows you
oh no,
like
I
the
don't have that.
sounds and the smells and the different things of the coffee roast. The thing is, if you really read this stuff, it can actually be a little inconsistent.
Hmm.
So like there's debate on really, like when second crack hits, is that full city or is that full city plus roast? You know, unfortunately, I like it somewhere between the two, and unfortunately you really don't know how close second crack is. I mean, it could be 3 minutes away, it could be 30 seconds away. So that's where just kind of looking at the beans, you stop the rotisserie, and I've got a flashlight that I kind of look at the color of the bean. I try to learn what each variety, the general color that I'm looking for. Some can actually smell the smoke. I'm not that good.
Oh yeah.
They could smell the smoke coming off of the roast and know what stage the bean is at. So, again, with me, it's very hit or miss because a lot of my steps are manual.
Yeah.
Um,
But you
but
get
so
used
here,
to it.
yes,
You kind of get us an intuitive sense, I guess.
a little bit, but the common theme with a lot of home roasters that even a bad roast at home is better than a good roast at Starbucks.
Uh-oh, Starbucks isn't going to be our sponsor here.
No, they're not.
Donuts.
No, they're not. No, but they don't need our, they don't need our recommendation because any store that I go to around a Starbucks drive-through, I
Yeah,
avoid that until past noon because I can't even get in and out of parking spots. They are not, short of a customer base.
right.
But yes, here's the slide of me actually dumping from the basket into a bowl, and then I don't think you have pictures of me. I actually take this bowl back over in front of the fan and will kind of pick up the beans and drop them in front of the fan, which further lets some of the chaff that got stuck in the bowl, as well as putting more cool air around the beans
Hmm.
uh, to help cool them. And then I do something that I actually just posted on the Facebook group recently where um, I pre-cool a cookie sheet on a quick freeze shelf that we have in our second refrigerator, and I'll actually dump the beans on that and put them up there for about 3 to 5 minutes to further cool the beans and stop the cooking process. I don't let the beans get cold when I pull them out of there. They're kind of just warm to the touch. But when you finally put the beans up, you don't want them to be warm. You want them to be, I mean, hot. Really, you don't want them to be hot or very warm. You want them to be just
So
kind of
when
lukewarm
you get to this
before you
point,
start to contain them. Yes, and that's me taking them off of the
the cooled cookie.
cookie tray, right, and putting them into one of the mason jars that I'm going to just kind of loosely put the lid on and let them enter the degassing process for the next few days. That's generally how I store them. Of course, these were the quart jars. I don't think I had gotten the half-gallon jars when we were when you were here and we were taking these pictures.
Hmm.
But that's the general sense. Yeah, I'm
So
just
about
kind of getting them into the jar there.
so about how many days before you get it into these containers?
Sometimes sometimes I'm just lazy and I just leave them in the mason jar for a week. It really depends. I don't have a lot of these cans, and in fact, my wife accidentally washed one of them
Oh,
and ruined the valve. So I've got one less now, and I've got a daughter that enjoys my coffee, so she actually has one or two of these cans at any one time in rotation, because I usually deliver her beans, her coffee in one or two of these. So it just depends. It's not a real science, but they're just easier to kind of store it and keep it handy. That when it's time to brew coffee in the morning, just grab one of those tins based on what I want. And I actually weigh my beans. I usually use about 35 to 37 grams of coffee beans for about a 20-ounce cup of coffee, which is a very concentrated. There's rules of thumb. There's a whole water to coffee ratio.
Well, we're going to
I
do
don't
a video
go
on
by
that with you. I think we're going to have you show us how you
do the brew method.
brew the thing. This was
Yeah, and that's another thing. I kind of developed my own thing, of course. Just I like to listen to what's happening out in the world, and then I kind of just come up with my own methods. Because
does this
sometimes it
save
just
you money, this process? Or I mean
it
obviously
might. It might. I mean, like I said, the green coffee beans are only about $6 a pound, and then you pay shipping. So usually that's why I like to buy a lot at once, because the shipping price is fixed. It's about $8 to ship. Sweet Maria's is in Oakland, California, so for about $8 in about little under a week, depending on how bad shipping is, to about a week's time it takes me to get. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and then I think if you buy volume, you might get a little bit of a discount if you buy more coffee. But it's still, it probably works out to about $5.50, $6 a pound. So I guess you look at it that way. But I'm not doing it for the money saving.
yeah.
I'm doing it because I'm drinking the best cup of coffee on the face of the earth, as far as I'm concerned.
But you have been
Sometimes it's
saying that you're cheap, so you kind of have a balance, I guess, of the taste,
yeah, but the
quality.
money saving is not applied here, because I can't find a cup of coffee really as good as I'm roasting and brewing at home. I can't find it anywhere. If I could, and I just didn't have the time, right? It's a time cost benefit. There are some times that I just don't feel like roasting coffee, because it can take a couple of hours to
Yeah.
do it.
So
And if I'm busy, I don't want to do it. I might be willing to pay that, but I can't find that coffee, so I'm doing it just because, like, I gotta have coffee.
so if you had your druthers, you told me if you could streamline your coffee making and get your wish, you said that you would like to have this Ayala
Oh, a bullet.
bullet,
Oh, a
and
bullet.
tell me why
Absolutely.
what would that do to improve the process, and why would that be
Well,
worth
you can see in the picture on the left, you can actually hook up a computer through a USB cable, and there's a computer brain in this thing, right? This is a high end. This is almost a low level commercial. Basically, what they did, they took a commercial level roaster, someone that does like hundreds or thousands of pounds of coffee, or however much the commercial ones do, and just took every aspect of that and put it in a small roaster that I think this thing can do 1 kilo, 2.2 pounds at a time. But you can do back-to-back roasts in about every 10 minutes. So you can do 5 to 6 batches of 2 pounds of coffee every hour. And so, I mean, I could almost, if I wanted to, and I guess there's a small part of me that would like to get into a mini commercial level. I mean, because I'm actually unemployed at the time for about 2 years now. Luckily, we're kind of self-sufficient at the moment. But if I wanted to make some pocket change, and maybe just roast for extended friends, family, or a small group of local people, kind of like a farmer's
club or something?
stand, would sell to locals, something like that. I mean, I don't know that I want to get big on the internet at this point. Something like this would be perfect, and the whole thing is between the brain that's in the unit and then recording your roast into your computer. You can literally get a roast just how you want it, and then you can literally hit play You dump the same amount of beans, same type of beans in, hit play, and you're going to repeat that roast identically every single time,
Mhm.
and do that at every 10 minutes. um, yeah, that it's gonna that would totally, like you said, streamline, save me the trouble of having to, you know, watch temperatures and stop the thing and do the stirring and all that. This thing is a self-contained um, masterpiece of
How
a
much does
mini roaster.
how much do these go for generally?
Yeah, so $3,000. I mean, there was a time in my life that I made that kind of money, and if I was into this hobby then, I probably would already have one of these things.
Well,
It
I
says that in the
appreciate you coming
instructions.
and talking about your process. I think it's really interesting and it's very educational and informative. And so we have the Sweet Marias and Coffee Bean Corral, and I'm going to add in a shot of the Facebook page after this, and um, we'll get together again and we'll do the coffee brewing video.
I'd be more than happy.
Great.
It is a labor of love.
Okay, so thanks for stopping to chat with us. I appreciate it.
More than welcome. It's been my pleasure.